recording.
All right, so there's been a very exciting Reddit post and discussion going on that was brought up by Unicorns of Love's manager. Uh, Essentially, the idea is that if you bring Korean imports to the EU LCS, there are several negatives about that, and instead, players should really focus on not being toxic and being good community members within EU so that orgs feel more incentivized to do so. I am going to be discussing this with the most notorious, Korean lover in the League of Legends scene, LS, and then of course myself, who apparently depending on who you ask, I am a European fan person, a Chinese dick sucker. I don't know. I go by a lot of things. Oh, also I hate all North Americans. It's the other aspect. So I mean,
We
it
got
really
that in
depends
common,
on
Kelsey. No, I'm kidding, but
what you decide. So I guess we hopefully will have a couple of different perspectives on this issue, and we can talk about problems with imports or without imports in various regions. So.
okay. Well, the original Romain post where I think the first most interesting thing is the ratio of Korean imports brought in Koreans in the LCS and then the ones in playoffs, because that's just a false statistic in a way, because there can only be so many Koreans in the playoffs because of the import rule.
No,
So that's a little bit misleading.
I agree with that.
Um,
I think, to an extent, it supports his point because you're only having two teams necessarily with success with Korean imports out of the three, but it's not really that strong again because no matter how many Koreans you add, you can only get 6 max. So keeping a 50% ratio actually doesn't really support his point at all.
yeah. And then I think the other problem in terms of the Korean imports is because the sample size is also low, because there's only 2.5 years of evidence to support a claim, and then on top of that, as we just mentioned, the teams and the limited number of Koreans that can appear in the playoffs and how successful that is, but also the fact that there's not enough information that is public on what causes teams with Koreans to fail, because that can be like a false cause fallacy. It's not necessarily the Koreans that are causing the team to fail. And this is something that we'll talk about later on about it's mostly the staff and the organization's fault that most teams in EU, NA, etc. are failing. And I don't think that it has to do necessarily with Koreans. But in that regard, I think you and I do both agree that Korean imports are not necessarily a Band-Aid in a way, 100% of the time. You can't just bring them in and they'll instantly get you results. Yeah.
And I think one of the big differences that we'll probably talk about more between the Korean esports scene and I guess the Western or Chinese esports scenes is I don't think that a lot of the successful Korean organizations believe in shortcuts, which is what, to an extent, like bringing Korean players over is you're expecting your players to fix your problems for you. Mm-hmm. And so when you're bringing Koreans over, you're saying that players are the problem. And I think that that's just completely incorrect and completely misdiagnoses why teams are behind.
Mm-hmm. And I mean, the other thing, I mean, we can transition this into the staff again, where the staff don't even know how to properly assess or import proper Koreans, other than if the Korean was already famous inside of Korea. Like if they try to bring in a named player that was having high success in the LCK, or they came off of a top team or something. Almost 90% of the time or something, when you've seen an NA-EU org or something try to import a random Korean that was either on a Challenger Series team or he came straight out of solo queue or something, it's been absolutely disastrous. I mean, there's a Korean that is currently in the EU LCS, and I remember when he got picked up, I immediately reached out to the manager and I said, why? Or like, why did this guy get picked up? And he said, oh, well, so-and-so said he was good, and so, another person said he was good. So it was like a word of mouth type of a thing. There was no real assessment. There was no real evaluation on, is this guy good or is he not good? And I can understand from the perspective that they don't have time to fly the team out to Korea, scrim with him, or bring the Korean out, scrim with him, and then decide to send him back to Korea, then get his visa. But the problem remained that the person was hard stuck in D4, D5 for 1,000 games. And I don't care if he has a secondary ID that's D1 or D2 or something that he camps the MMR on. You don't bring someone like that into the EU LCS. And then, the counter argument is, well, he got Challenger in EU West. Big fucking deal. Like, what the fuck does that even mean? It doesn't mean anything.
When you import a player who, and this may be part of the Romain's post that I agree with, is with additional barriers to communication or to just like being comfortable within your environment and your culture, you need to offset it with other advantages, I think. So like this player you have to have some reason to think that this player will work really well with the team or that he's going to carry you. And I feel like D4 in Korea is not actually going to cut that at all. So I think that when you import, you're automatically saying that like this player is just so good that it offsets like the difficulties that we have in bringing him in. And I don't think that that type of player is going to do that. And sending the message that that type of player and that you believe that type of player is going to do that actually really hurts, I think, to an extent, the motivation of maybe your player base or other players who really are looking to get on a pro team.
Right. But this then goes into something that we talked about a little bit before we started the video, where at any given time in Challenger and Masters, there's X amount of players. Now, I have personal experience of seeing very, very high MMR players from NA and EU come to Korea, and I've seen where they've stagnated in Korea. And I'm not talking about pros, I'm talking about the talent pool, so to speak. And when they stagnate at such a low MMR, and yet they are able to climb so high on their own respective servers, it really begs the question that the talent pool is also getting hindered inadvertently through things like the lack of care, I guess, that the players have for their own region. Like the lack of seriousness. They don't actually all actively play meta champions. They're a little bit abrasive with each other. They're distant with each other. And what ends up happening is the solo queues in NA and EU keep getting worse and worse and worse because there's a detachment from Challenger Series, LCS, and solo queue. Whereas in Korea, if you're a solo queue player, if you get high enough, you start meeting the pros. They don't care if you're... Like, the whole point about toxicity, which we talked about earlier, no one gives a shit. No one fucking gives a shit. And if you need like living proof of it, there's the NA jungler right now that he's not allowed to play by Riot, extremely high on the ladder, and a ton of pros interact with him, they talk with him, and they message him, Tarzan. And he's notorious for toxicity. There are multiple pros in NA and EU that were notorious for severe levels of toxicity in both solo queue and even competitive. It doesn't mean anything. No one gives a shit. No one actually discredits you. But I think what Romain's talking about is like when he's going down the list and he's saying, oh, well, you're toxic, whatever. This then brings in the point of why the fuck are your players actually evaluating who's going to be on the team? Why the fuck are you not doing that? Are you just like writing the bill? They're like the father that doesn't actually see their kid. They see them bi-weekly on the weekends. They go into the bedroom with their mistress and they just give their kid like $100 bill or something to do whatever. It's just gross. Yeah.
So first, to address your point about the ladders being different, I think that most people would agree that like North America is probably the worst cultural environment in terms of solo queue, and then Korea is the best. So I do think that there is a distinction between EU solo queue and NA solo queue and the environment. And actually, one of the positives of the EU solo queue environment is the level of toxicity. Like, if we're being honest, because if you're just bully the shit out of each other, then like you have to get good, or you just drop out and you won't achieve like anything with that. And I think it can be a level of motivation that people don't necessarily see. The other factor is that I do think, the main difference between the challengers that you've faced or the challengers that have come to Korea for coaching versus like the CS and the LCS players is going to be a mentality thing. And so like there is no reason these players can't like get better if they have an incentive to do so. And if you're relying, like, I feel like there's almost a game being played, right? The way that Romain laid out this list of things where he's like, okay, we have this ladder of players, and we ask our pros, like, is this guy good? And he says, no, he's a one trick, no, he's toxic. It's like, well, this incentivizes you being nice or kissing up to like certain pro players instead of actually just like fucking being good at the game.
Right.
And so instead you have this really weird mentality that the pros are dictating something when you have staff that should be able to assess, like, does this guy have potential? Okay, maybe he's toxic, but we don't have the luxury to just like throw out toxic players when a lot of times toxic players are that way because they're really motivated, right? That's like kind of ridiculous. So I think, like, first of all, like, the main point for this is do your job. Like, just shut up and do your job. And I think that if your coach can't look at a player and decide whether or not that has the potential to do well, regardless of what the players are saying his attitude is, then you're already in trouble. Like, you're already behind.
Right. If the staff isn't prepared to evaluate on or through their own means, then I don't think they should be even signing players, because then everything at the end of the day is word of mouth. You know, it's players saying who's good and who's not and whatnot, and it ties back into what you're talking about and about the kiss up type thing. You know, the ass kissing or the brown nosers. That shit runs rampant in NA and even EU to a degree, but I think to a lesser extent. And to touch on what you said about the toxicity, I completely agree with that. I've never, if someone gets to that MMR and they're toxic, I've never, I mean, I not going to say that there aren't a few, you know, screws loose in some people's heads, right? But for the most part, they do genuinely care. And this makes me think back to like StarCraft 1, StarCraft 2, etc. Idra is one of the most notorious bad manner or toxic players in the history of esports. And he wasn't toxic just to be toxic or just to be an asshole. He was toxic because he was passionate about the game. There are Koreans that are ultra toxic. Not so much nowadays in recent times, since esports has evolved a little bit more. But going back into StarCraft 1 and StarCraft 2, some of the greatest players of all time were notorious for being ultra toxic people. Isla Vuv, one of the StarCraft Terrans, who's now the coach of Afrika, was notorious for his bad manner and disrespecting other pro gamers while being a pro gamer. I don't think that's really a criteria to judge people on, and I think to then state that people need to be nice and they need to be caring, I think that's bullshit, because then it goes full circle and it ties into the League of Cards, which is something that I've personally witnessed, and we can talk about it more with the thing that we spoke about earlier today, where people reach out and they're like, what do you think of this Korean? Or what do you think of this player? And I've seen it multiple times where pros, or not pros, but players that don't deserve tryouts get tryouts. And players that just don't belong playing in the pro scene anymore are still playing somehow, because other newcomers that are mechanically more adept or they're more deserving just aren't inside of the social network. And so because of that, they're never let in, because it's very controlled. And it's very scary in a way, because either you get so fucking good that they can't ignore you, or you're just going to be thrown to the side.
And this is to an extent where I will agree that importing isn't going to be the solution right now, because if you aren't even watching your own solo queue games, like your own rising talents, and using that to decide who's going to be the next like player you want on your team, if your staff isn't even competent enough to do that, then how are you going to be expected to watch Korean solo queue and to try to talk to Korean players and learn about that? Like, you spend all year watching your own region and knowing what your team needs and what the other teams are doing. So like, it's not as much of a demand to just look at your own solo queue, and you're not even doing that. Like, why aren't you? I don't know. It's really bizarre.
It doesn't make any sense. And the amount of people that will message me, and I'm sure that you get messages as well during off seasons or downtime, or even towards the end of seasons, right? And they're like, oh, what do you think of this Korean player or this Korean player? And I'm just sitting there thinking to myself, how is this person even on your fucking radar? Like, through what means did you get this person's ID? In what way did they come up? Like, why? And then most of the time, they're actually going to go with that person. And it's just the most bizarre thing in the world because I'm like, no, he's not deserving of being a of being a pro. And I don't know. I really don't know how to judge it. And I think that it speaks to a severe lack of detachment between the orgs and the higher end staff. Because even some of the coaches are affected by this League of Card type mentality, where they themselves are actually inside of the network. They're not really coaches, so to say, or not in the sense that we're trying to talk about the way that they should be. But they're, yeah.
But yeah, I will go ahead and just like straight up call out, I mean, not by name, because I feel like I don't have to use a name because I've seen it with Chinese organizations, I've seen it with North American organizations and European organizations where one name will come up over and over again. It won't just be one org messaging me or one coach or one manager messaging me about this player. It will be another one. And I'll just be like, why is everyone talking about this really obscure, weird solo queue player who is like a Bard one trick or something? Like why are people talking about this player? And mostly it comes from the fact that orgs use the same like Korean scouts, like the same collection of Korean scouts, and like people have their Skype contacts and they talk to them and they give the same suggestions, and orgs for whatever reason don't stop to consider that this guy probably is getting like a cut for helping this player get on a team, so he's incentivized to talk up this player and to say bullshit about this player, right? And then like organizations are just, this guy probably knows what he's talking about. He's got a lot of players on his list and he's giving me this one as a suggestion for some reason. Maybe he gets a bigger cut with this player. I don't know. Like, it's
but then
very
the question is, what makes those people qualified to determine if these players are good or not? Because when you really look at some of the people that evaluate players, it's sort of like, who the fuck are you? It doesn't even make sense.
Joyluck probably is a very well-known like public example, and he even went on a Korean talk show where he explained that like he recommended Huni to Fnatic in part because he used to play ranked games with Huni. So the question becomes like, does he play ranked games with all of the Korean players he recommends? Like, is he going to have that kind of insight with all of these players? Or was it just like this one guy that he definitely knew was a sure thing?
I mean, there's other examples of Western people that evaluate Koreans, and then it really begs the question of how really involved are they? Because you can't just watch games and think that you know what you're talking about, okay? Like, that's Reddit. We already know that doesn't really work. So what makes the person really qualified to then tell organizations to invest tens of thousands of dollars potentially on a player to acquire the visa, etc.? That seems really dangerous to me in a lot of ways, when they're not held accountable, when the player either just does absolutely nothing, and then, next thing you know, they're recommending more players. And as you mentioned, they have incentive probably to some degree to recommend these players. I have almost never seen what's the word for it? Like or like a non-connected recommendation. Someone that just doesn't know the person at all, and whatever, and they're like, hey, look, you really need to look at this guy and pick him up. I've never talked to him, I've never met him or anything like that. That's on you. But from this point of view, he fits all this criteria. Go and get him. I almost never see that happen. In some way, there's always some sort of a social connection in some way, shape, or form. And that's just, it's all politics. Politics, that shit just runs rampant in NA and EU. And this ties back into something that we said earlier, where in NA and EU, you don't have the luxury of threatening a player with getting benched. Because there's such a discrepancy between all of not just the lanes, but also the players. I mean, in Korea, there's obviously all-stars, just like in China, there's going to be some all-stars, etc. But I think that the all-star to like average player ratio is much less in these regions than it is in, say, something like NA or EU.
Sure.
Would you agree?
Yeah. I think that's to an extent. And I do think that there's it's one of the weird roster building mentalities that I think is a little bit larger in North America and Europe and China is that we need a star player to build around. So automatically you're having this like weird idea that we need this guy to carry us, and you're depending on this aspect instead of building a team plan or teamwork, or having like when you're building a roster, you not only need to consider like how good is this particular player, but can we make these players mesh well together personality wise? Like, do we have the resources to do that? And is it something that might happen long term? Whereas I feel like in the West, you have instances like, oh, this guy is really good. We're going to actively go to this guy and tell him we're going to build a roster around him, right? And so we're putting already putting pressure on him to an extent, saying that like if this team fails, it's like your fault. When I feel like this is really disingenuous, right? Like this isn't the way that it necessarily should be. So you have a lot of teams that have like a star that's highlighted, and if this player is causing problems, you can't necessarily bench him, which I don't necessarily think can be the response in the West either, because again, we're really bad at developing the talent to bring up underneath compared to like Korean teams. So we're really bad at like keeping someone that we're training up, right? We don't necessarily have teams doing that right now. So you can't auto bench someone who's doing really well for you. You have to demand more from your staff to make this work out. You have to have someone who has more authority with the players. You have to have this type of situation, and like if you're not doing your job, I mean, I feel like I'm being circular about this, but it's actually just something that really drives me insane. So
I would be hard-pressed to believe that most orgs are doing their job, because most of them just run in circles. And they are so preoccupied. So basically, they have a cancer inside of themselves, in a way. And rather than acknowledge that they need to remove the cancer and, go through the chemotherapy or whatever, or get a surgery, they just keep putting Band-Aids on top of it. And, they keep stacking it up. And yeah, you can open up your fridge and see all fresh fruit on top, but, when you get to the bottom, there's mold. And that mold is always going to keep creeping up and going back to the top. And you can keep putting new fresh fruit on top of it. And this has been the method of a lot of some of the top EU and NA teams. But at the end of the day, it's always going to come full circle. And it's not really going to fix. And this is something that's interesting about Korea, where most of the Korean orgs, they can break an entire roster, take 4 new rookies, 1 veteran or something, and then in a month or something be better than top NA and EU teams. But I do think that also ties in a little bit with the players and culture, right? Because Korean players, when they fuck up, it's usually for the most part, oh, I fucked up, I suck, it's my fault. I could have done this better. I should have done this better, etc. NA is like, well, shit, job security, it's this guy's fault. He did this wrong. My coach didn't get me a latte this morning, so I played bad in scrims. The sun was in my eyes. Like, it's literally everyone's fault but theirs. And then because there's such gaps and inconsistency between the level of practice and the solo queues, it leads to players getting... They would rather be ruined by... They would rather be ruined by praise than saved by criticism. And that's a problem that NA and EU just have at its core.
Yep. I mean, I do think it's more of a North American thing, just like having talked to a lot of people in Europe and a lot of people in NA, and it's definitely, if you criticize something about a North American team, automatically there is pushback and rejection.
Yeah.
And I think it's really kind of bizarre. I do think also that, again, we're talking about, like, I acknowledge that there are certain cultural advantages to like Korean players and the way that they're constantly thinking about a game, but I do think that if you talk to someone from a different cultural background and you tell them, okay, like, knock it off, there are no shortcuts to being good. You have to actually think about these factors. You have to ask yourself, like, why you're doing them. And you have to make this particular aspect work. Then I think that what really motivates me to say this is that I think that the desire to win and succeed is universal. And it's just the difference in how people are brought up to perceive how this is achieved that could potentially create cultural differences. And there are ways to leverage, I think, certain European or North American cultural differences to find success. And that's something that we need to think more about. But if you just come in with a baseline knowledge as a staff member and you're working with players who are master tier or diamond or something and trying to train them up to challenger or to play in your LCS team later, then you have to start immediately removing these types of things. So again, we're demanding more from staff, and our staff is more behind. So this is like a legit problem that is being faced by European, Chinese, and North American organizations.
Right. And it sucks. It sucks really bad because another thing that I guess I can mention on that topic is, so I come from StarCraft background, and in that, I noticed that Korea, eventually the entry, so because the game is ever changing, and it's not a simple game to really get into anymore, because everything is too evolved, it's too advanced, and it's weird because there's so much information available to you that you don't have to go through the process now to learn what everyone did on the way up, way back then. And so you can propel yourself forward. But because the entry level is low, and because of how NA and EU solo queue operates, I feel like it's a lot more difficult for talent to actually make its way up, even from Diamond, into Masters and then ultimately Challenger, because they're not going to get any aid. And when the game begins to then cycle into, like social networks and circles and whatnot, people end up getting cut out, and then the gap keeps creating, and then eventually your talent pool just dries up because there's no one new coming into the top end of the ladder. And that's a very scary thought, because that would then trigger, almost in a way, the end of times for the game in some way. Mm-hmm. I mean, StarCraft 2 is still alive. I mean, it may be on life support, but that's not something that you want to happen. Whereas in Korea, you still see talent fucking coming up from mid diamond, even bottom diamond. They're in high masters now or something, and they have a legitimate shot of going pro. And I feel like Korea, I think it says something about the entry level to test for LCK or something is Diamond 2, 50 LP. That says something entirely different from NA and EU, where you need to be XLP Challenger. So,
yeah, I think, when you look at China and what has happened for the past 2 years in China, which is literally organizations have partnered with streaming companies to throw money at the names that are appearing top 2 at Worlds, right? Mm-hmm. This is what has happened consistently for the past 2 years. And then they bring them over, and these players are playing with the team, and initially there might be a boost in motivation that's coming from their background, but eventually the environment, which is very commercially driven, these players do start to decline in their work ethic. They don't play as much, and then at the same time, teams aren't looking at Chinese players to come up or bring up behind them. So right now we're having a lot of these big name Koreans going back, and you're seeing just this weird dearth of talent in LPL, where people will just have really bad bottom lanes for no reason. And China used to be known for their AD carry talent, and now there's just no one coming up. And this is a big problem that I think is to an extent exacerbated by the import scenario, where people are kind of expecting Korean infrastructure to train players for them, and then they're not. You can only train based on the Riot import rules, you can only have Korean infrastructure train 2 players for you, right? You have to actually train 3 other players. You can't just let this happen. So you need to start thinking about how are we training our own player base, and that isn't working out. So.
Well, I think this lets us transition into our next point of G2 versus Kongdu Monsters, and how it's not indicative of the gap closing, but rather it's getting worse. When Kongdu Monsters, let's be honest, they're not even an LCK team. They're really not. They are Challenger Series level at the end of the day. And when they're beating your top team that a lot of them have been together for a while, right? You have Sven and Mithy still together. You have Perks still there. Actually, they're the same roster, right, from Worlds.
They're the same roster from
Yeah.
Worlds, so
So
they've been together for a full split,
they've
and
yeah.
then this split.
So they've been together for an extremely long time. When Kongdu Monsters is threatening to beat you in a best of three, um, even if they're making it look close, right? In any regard, that's not something that you need to be proud about. That's really sad.
Mm-hmm.
Um, that is like Kongdu is not even a B team in Korea. They're like a C team or a C tier team. Um, I mean, this goes back again into the staff and the infrastructure in some regard, because how is this happening? Because NA and
I wanted to
EU, go ahead, go.
I actually wanted to ask you about this. So there's this really weird narrative that the EULCS broadcast, and to an extent G2 themselves have been propelling, and I don't know if you've heard it, which is that right now, uh, the G2 are not focusing on training their early game. Okay, they're assuming that enemy players will not make mistakes in laning phase, and so they are trying to actively not punish laning phase mistakes. Also, they are not focusing on early game macro transitions as much. They're assuming you can just kind of stay in lane and farm evenly, right? And then mid game, it's about making Baron decisions, and that's what we're training now. And we're not training the other things, and we can only train one thing at a time. So, like, I wanted to ask your perception on this thing, because to me it seems really counterintuitive. Because I feel like you can spend time, like, a week training one thing, a week training another thing, and then like go back and forth and back and forth. And if you can't, it almost conflates to me the idea that early game laning and individual skill is the same as early game macro. Because if you watch a lot of the G2 games, like, there aren't backs coordinated between Trick and Mithy. Like, there aren't necessarily instances where they are able to, like, abuse the jungle pathing as well. Like, they don't necessarily play around strong lanes for invades as well, things like this. So I just like, to me it seems really weird that this is the mentality that G2 have, and I don't know if you have an opinion on this.
My perspective on it is that it's always backwards to forwards, whereas NA and EU historically was always forward to backwards. They would always hyper focus on early game and then focus on mid game, and they would disregard late game. Korea would always look at late game, then mid game, then early game, because this is something I was just about to say. NA and EU does have world elite level players. Sven and Mithy could play in LCK. Bjergsen could play in LCK. Jensen could play in LCK. Forgiven could play in LCK. There's multiple players that they could play in LCK. And it's not like they're not worthy on a mechanical level or a game knowledge level in terms of their role. But then the problem is the game understanding across other roles is stunted. And this is something I've talked about before. Korean pros, for the most part, they can play all 5 roles at a Korean challenger level or a near Korean challenger level. The same can't be said for Western pros. They would be hard-pressed to be able to get anywhere near their main role on an off role. And so when you transition it into the thing that you're talking about, where G2 is trying to focus on one thing at once and at different parts, etc., it becomes even more difficult when the players are not necessarily in line with each other in terms of their understanding of each other's respective roles. And so it causes a problem, and then you can just end up endlessly going in circles and cycles. I don't think that it's necessarily bad to assume that your opponents won't make mistakes, because my philosophy on coaching and my approach, and also many StarCraft players, because I got it from some of the StarCraft players, was that if you just play to the best ability that opponents can do, then it doesn't matter what they can do, because you don't need to have all the answers because your opponent can't ask you all the questions. So if you're just in a movable wall, it doesn't matter. But I think that if they're not looking to punish, or if they're intentionally going out of their way to just not do it, and they're sticking into that kind of a style, like, I could kill you here, but I'm not going to, because I'm just going to play my one-dimensional style, then that'll end up being catastrophic in the end, if that makes sense. Does that answer everything?
Yeah, that does answer it. Do you think that, like, I mean, I guess for me, do you think that their approach of training, like, late game macro and then, like, not caring as much about early game macro transitions until like maybe even next split is productive, or because I feel like to me you have to constantly be exercising each like fundamental, but I don't know if that makes sense to you or not.
So here's my, so I recently made the video pros and their stagnation, right? The LS logic. I don't know if you watched it. And I had this talk with multiple pros. For the most part, pros aren't getting better anymore mechanically. In fact, some of them are actually worse. They're no longer in their prime, even though their knowledge of the game is heightened, and it enables them to abuse or take advantage of certain situations better than they could in their former years. So yeah, I feel like, for instance, hypothetically, let's say that you resurrect Samsung White, right? The game has completely morphed. It's a different, it's an entirely different game, new patch, different champions, etc. Give them 1 or 2 months on the current patch, they take games off of LCK teams. I think if they properly can catch up and they have the training tools and the kit needed to catch up, and I think that that's an interesting thing to look at, because then it really, so I guess to transition this into the question, the early game and the mid game is going to be ever changing inherently because of patches. And that's something that'll never keep up. What is always going to remain a constant and a fundamental inside of MOBAs, and this is just my own perspective and the way that I look at LoL and how I coach and how I analyze it, the end game is a constant. The end game is the only thing that will always remain the same. Because the variables at that stage of the game, 40, 45, 50 minutes, are almost always the same. There's almost very little or no change at all. Sure, the champions change, but that still doesn't impact the way that, you know, minions have set MS, minions deal X damage, Baron spawns every X minutes, Dragon spawns every... These things are just constants, whereas early and mid game are not constants because the meta is constantly changing. So if you work on early game things, there's a very real possibility that in 4 weeks that's not possible, because either the meta shifts or Riot comes out with a new patch and all of a sudden lane swaps don't work anymore, and the type of rotations that you were practicing so much don't work anymore because the champions that were required to do that are phased out of the meta. And that can be disastrous, because then you're constantly training things that just end up getting phased out.
I think to an extent though, actively thinking about the early game is, again, because we talk about advantages that are not being leveraged. I think actually you have more of a focus on early game in the West, and you have seen Western teams be able to get advantages early against, I'm not going to say Korean teams generically, but let's say SKT or Samsung. And I think that this is an advantage that isn't necessarily being leveraged. So I actually do kind of admire the approach of looking at how can we push this and how can we then transition this lead further in the game. I do think that there is a lack of fundamentals, but the fact that they are constantly thinking about how we adapt our early game instead of working on something that's a fixed input is actually almost a way to be creative, or a way to kind of, as long as you keep exercising these muscles, they don't go away. Like, how do we think about how the early game changes, like constantly from week to week to week?
Right.
I think is something that I do want to encourage. So this is like maybe a different perspective, but I think that like to an extent, it's a mistake to ignore the advantages that they currently have in favor of just working on the things where they're lacking.
Right. I agree with you that it is something interesting, and I do agree that Korea has a weakness in that regard because of their intentional disregard for it. I know that you didn't follow StarCraft, but in StarCraft, that was, I mean, historically, this is the way that I view the regions. So I'll just like categorize them. Korea has always been the slow, methodical, robotic, slow to adapt, slow to pick up things, not innovative, etc. region. Europe was always the bigger brother to NA in a mechanical regard. They were less creative, less intuitive, etc. They were more so just, you know, the big guy that weighed a lot and he had a lot of muscle. And maybe he was more toxic and drunk in rage, whatever. NA was always creative in StarCraft 1, StarCraft 2. That was how they found wins. They came up with these really wonky builds and super fucking creative openings and stuff. CLJ was basically like a living embodiment of that for a long time with their creative lane swaps and how they would move and coordinate around the map. And that's always been NA's edge, as they've been very intellectual and looking for strategy, looking for ways to cheese the early game. And then China was just always raw mechanics. They were like Korea, NA and EU combined in a way. They were raw mechanics and looking for micro edges, and then they would just go ham at those micro edges. I think that it is important because the game is ever changing, whereas something like StarCraft or Warcraft, well, Warcraft I think maybe still gets patched, I don't know anymore, but StarCraft almost never sees change anymore, right? So the game is constant. Whereas in League of Legends, because there is that chaos factor, it enables certain players that thrive in that environment to still remain relevant. Whereas in StarCraft, they get phased out once all the answers and solutions come out, and that's when the Korean approach becomes the most efficient, the most optimal.
Yeah, I think it's interesting. I think to an extent, we're seeing a mix of like these different approaches now. Generally, the way I think about it is the Chinese like think a lot more about teamfight compositions. So like that's something they practice, which isn't necessarily, it's like really focus on this specific mechanic and how we're going to make it work. And they've fallen behind in so much, just so much, because they expect raw skill to carry them, and it hasn't. I think North America have had some creativeness, but I think they're almost going through like a Chinese phase right now, in terms of we're bringing the big names and they're supposed to carry us. But that I'm actually really happy that isn't consistently working, because you still have teams like TSM and FlyQuest at the top of the standings that aren't importing big Korean names. And I wish that like OMG hadn't collapsed on themselves and had a huge internal fight, because they were for a while consistently competing with it, and it would have shown like that there are alternatives to just bringing the best players over. But I think that to an extent, so NA's creativity is kind of being sapped right now because of that. And when you look at also European teams, like they were really good with the lane swap meta. I actually for a while thought of Europe as like the lane swap region, because they would lane swap the most. There were like a lot more subtleties to some of their lane swaps, and so some of their early macro I think got really set behind because they removed lane swaps, and now you have to really focus on, I guess, jungle mid, and using mid pressure to invade and take control of the map this way. And there's not as much coordination between like jungle and lanes, and that's if your gap is in understanding that, you can't necessarily rely on having a laning phase advantage or being even in laning phase, or having only a small deficit to just focus on late game. And I think that the fact that Europe kind of had this kind of weird lane swap advantage in the past suggests to me that they can think creatively about how to use the early game and can come up with other solutions. So I would say that that's, I don't know, to me this is like an interesting and separate discussion, but it goes back to tie into what we were talking about, just the fact that G2 maybe are actively thinking about coaching philosophy, or just having a staff that is actively thinking about coaching philosophy, and changing your approach there is going to be more useful. But I caution them to avoid just like removing something that was an advantage before.
Right. And something I want to mention about G2, and I will concede the fact that I do not actively watch EU LCS, so some of my things will be just based on opinions and hearsay, almost to a certain extent. But in Korea, you have SKT, and then, you know, half a tier below them, you have KT, and then you have all the middle of the pack, and then you have at the very bottom of the barrel, I'm talking the fucking the trench in the Pacific Ocean, you have Kongdu Monsters. And I feel like in EU and NA, there's more, isn't there, there's a lot more chaos, isn't there? Where there's just a lot more bad teams and there's a lot more randomness.
In NA there is for sure. I think one criticism of Europe right now is actually that this season has been ridiculously predictable. And I think the reason why that's a criticism is that there's just not enough of a challenge or pushback on some of the top teams to kind of change or evolve or adapt. And so I do think that that's a valid criticism because also a lot of the top teams have, to an extent, kept core players. So you're again recycling some of the same players, some of the same ideas that worked last year. And I hesitate to say that predictability is necessarily a bad thing because I do think we are seeing some predictability to an extent in Korea, despite like Africa games and things like this. But I think challenge is necessary, and
Yes.
we are not seeing a recycling of talent. We're seeing a large recycling of talent in both teams and in staff. Like you see the same names that have failed staff positions
Right.
be promoted to other teams that are actually better. And you ask like, why is this happening? I've talked to this person, or I know this person's reputation, so why is he still getting jobs? And so I think this problem is just
Who we
kind of
talking about here, Kelsey?
chronic.
Who are we talking about? Do they happen to miss smites, or what are we? I mean,
Do they happen to miss
I don't know where we're going on this, but anyways, no, I think that what you're saying about the coaching and the staff is that people fail over and over again, and they have horrible records, and their history would suggest that they're not competent, and then so why? You know, and then really, what is their history other than, oh well, I played at a high level? That doesn't
I
fucking mean
played
anything.
at a high level, or I am friends with the players, right?
Right,
And
right. It's one of the two. League of Cards.
this is another problem, though, is that I think to an extent because staff are afraid to challenge players and have the players dictate whether or not they like them. Which I'm not advocating like someone who doesn't know what they're doing, obviously, to come in and say, oh, you should run this mastery page, or you're screwing up this rotation here, and not know what he's talking about. But I'm saying that like if you're not necessarily adding anything to the discussion or adding anything to the team, and all you're doing is being friends with or being making nice with the players, then that's not doing your job either. And
Sometimes.
it
Go.
guarantees that you get hired, rehired, but it's not necessarily doing your job.
In the same sense, I do want to touch on the comment that I made about X person. There's a lot that goes on that we don't also know about, right? And we end up just making baseless assumptions, right? And so there can be value in some areas, but it's not
Right.
necessarily the type of value that that team needs. And so what ends up occurring is that coach or analyst or whatever could be very good at one specific thing, but it just won't matter if the team is not receptive to it.
Yep, I agree with that. I think for I don't necessarily think not adding to the game knowledge aspect is bad because, like for example, there are coaches who are very open and upfront about the fact that they don't have good game knowledge, but they're good at facilitating discussion or making sure that all the players have to worry about is practicing and playing and working on their game. And I don't think that that's necessarily a bad thing. Like there's a lot of value to that as well. But I do think that if you're a member of staff and you're either not working on something that you're hired for, or you're not challenging people on something that you're hired for because you're afraid of losing your job,
Job security,
ultimately
right?
not losing
Right.
you're ultimately not doing your job.
So this also is a little bit interesting. The NA and EU are heavily concerned. I think you can correct me on China because I'm not knowledgeable about the subject there. But I know in Korea that they don't stream. They don't. I mean, their fans are nuts. Like in terms of getting them gifts, money, whatever, right? Whereas in NA and EU, I feel like a lot of the pros and people that want to be pros, they like the idea of being good without the commitment or what's required
Sure.
to actually be good. And what they want at the end of the day is they want those impressions on Twitter. They want those followers. They want the social connectivity because they're likely. I remember Thorin said this to me when I was having a conversation with him in that people that they quit esports, they come back to esports, quit esports, come back to esports. They realize that they can't get that sort of connectivity or that sort of authority anywhere else. And that's what they end up getting addicted to. And that's what they crave for, and that's what they desire. And when NA and EU is so hell-bent on success, because that's how you get the sponsors, that's how you get the money, the fans, because I would argue that NA and EU even more top heavy than Korea in recent times with players and teams, whereas Korea used to be ultra top heavy. But now with that sort of change, it requires you to always be concerned with, oh, what's happening next week, our next match. And it leads teams to devolving into, watching VODs of their upcoming opponent and just only zoning in on their upcoming opponent rather than growing themselves internally. Because that's not what people want to do. They don't have the discipline. They don't have the ability to sacrifice something that they don't want to do in order to better themselves. And that just ties in to cultural type stuff and staff. So tying this all the way back to G2 versus Kongdom Monsters, I feel like the gap is continuing to get worse, and I think that that's because of the bridge that is being created in terms of solo queue and because of the heavy recycling of players and certain staff that just doesn't make sense. And for people that obviously watch this video, they don't even realize that there are dozens and dozens and dozens of coaches and analysts that aren't named. You won't find them on LoL Esports Wiki, you won't find them on Twitter, but they're on the teams. They just don't get mentioned. And then you meet them one day and they're like, how many teams have you been on? They're like, oh, 8. And I'm like, what the fuck? Like, what the fuck? That doesn't even make sense. And then you have to wonder, like, how are they still getting on these teams? And then is it because there's no one else? Like, is no one actually submitting the job applications? Or, like, do they just interview well? And I don't know. It's really bizarre. Because the people that do evaluate and hire these people, they're not qualified to do so anyway. And it's really just a shit fest. I feel like some of the best management, staff, coaches, etc., historically were people that took a break from the game, so they no longer have bias, but they once played at the highest levels in some facet. So they're able to relate with the players on a level that a random Joe Schmo that has 5,000 games, peak gold 2, just can't relate with them on.
I think for sure those one thing in the West is it's a lot easier to get authority if that's the case. Like if you have, and that is a concern for staff for sure. If you have played professionally and you can relate to the players, I think that's definitely an advantage for sure. I mean, I don't think that those are the only good staff, right? Or that's the only way to be a good member of staff, but I do think that that's a definite advantage. So. But you have to, I think also that way kind of puts you in the mindset and the drive to advance. It's a demonstrated the fact that you've done that. If there's some like history where you have competed or been at the top of something, I think that demonstrates that you might have the competency or want to translate that skill into a staff position.
Another thing that people don't realize is that some of the greatest teams and orgs in esports history came at the cost of a very long time. And I remember this is something Thorin specifically talked about, I want to say about 2 years ago, because he referenced Samsung Blue. Before Samsung Blue and White rose to power, they were together for a very long time. Oh, yeah. Like the staff and the org were together for a very long time. And that was inside of the proper infrastructure and the proper network in order to achieve what they ended up achieving. And I mean, going into different esports titles here in Korea, you can find the same exact thing, where in NA, because of all of the recycling and stuff, you never really find that stability and that stable ground. And everything is just constantly different things, painted a different way. And it just ends up sucking really bad. Because I do feel bad that it's not like there's not good players in NA and EU.
For sure.
Some of the best players in the world are in NA and EU. And I'm not talking about Koreans, I'm talking about, Western players. And it sucks to see them compromised by their region and stuff. And something that we haven't mentioned once is I feel like, to a certain degree, Riot could influence things to a higher degree than what they're doing right now. And they opt out of it. And I think that is bizarre. And I think that the server move, for instance, like they located the LCS in one area, right, California, and they're like, oh, we're going to move the servers. Yeah. Like, what? Like, what the fuck is that? Like, that doesn't even make sense. Either the server should be like rotated or something. That was
Hmm.
a suggestion I saw that I think is actually really interesting because I could see that as being kind of cool. Like you rotate it around the U.S. I have no idea how that would be from a logistics standpoint, but
Yeah, it would probably be really complicated, but yeah.
that would probably be complicated. But it would be more beneficial to the region than just
Hmm.
straight butt fucking your pro players
Hmm.
because you're putting them at a disadvantage when they go international. It's just not fair.
Yeah.
And it sucks because it's like you watch the pros suffer. I don't know. I feel bad actually when I think about it. So, yeah.
Yeah, I feel really bad because I care about a lot about the Chinese players and the European players and yes, even the NA players, Twitter. But I do think that yeah, I feel really I agree. Like I think that this is just something that it's not the players' fault. And importing and also even Romain's suggestion on not importing are actually putting the focus back on the players and kind of to an extent saying it's the players' fault when it really isn't.
It's not. No.
Um, it's not the Korean players' fault, it's not the European or the NA or the Chinese players' fault. It's like, I don't know, it's really weird.
All right. Well, let's transition this into the last point of how can an EU or NA team beat a Korean team, and we're not talking about Congo monsters. We're talking about a real Korean team. And so I had the suggestion earlier on of if you were to do it right now, I feel like if you were to honestly try to stand a chance right now, it would require the superstars in NA and EU to drop out of the LCS, form a super team, and then form two sister teams with a super staff to support it, and that would be your best bet at this point in time. Because otherwise, you're looking at years of infrastructure reform and change. Yeah, that's my perspective
I
on it.
I think that you can't that's one option, but I think it like is dangerously close to looking for a shortcut. Obviously, it still
Right.
requires some sacrifice. But I do think that ultimately the best way to not just ensure that this year or next year you can compete with top Korean teams once, but that your esports organization going forward can continue to compete at the highest level. You do have to make the sacrifice to go to infrastructure, and people are looking at the top Korean pros because there's pressure to stay in the LCS. There's pressure to like have players that fans recognize and to have sponsorship engagement. But you do need, if you're going to do that, I think on top of that, you have to start actively scouting your own scene's talent. And if you're not already doing that, you should not be looking at Korea. Like, there's no way you should be looking at Korea. You need to start actively scouting your own scene's talent and building them up and working on having a staff that is equipped to do that, and building those types of situations and those types of conditions. And then like you have to look at it as a long-term goal. I don't think that what a lot of people are quick to gut react, and when Romain came on the EU LCS desk, like the quick gut reaction is, oh, we're just not gonna beat Korea. It's like, okay, that's not a place to start from, because there should be
Right.
like no genetic reason that you can't
There,
beat
yeah,
Korea,
there's
for
there's no
example.
genetic right.
And so you attack like the culture, and by the culture I don't mean like the culture of your country, I mean the culture of your practice ethic and your team environment, which is something you can control. So
I just hope that it doesn't eventually go into the StarCraft syndrome, where the Western teams keep losing, and then the gap, or as you said, or it's very predictable in EU, it's very unpredictable in NA, and things just continue to get more and more top heavy because certain teams are better at marketing than others, etc. And then StarCraft syndrome takes over, and all of a sudden the game begins to slowly die. And I think that Riot's intervention there is really important. And I'm not even sure how they actually do it. But I can see that if SK Telecom, for instance, wins Worlds again, you can view it from the perspective that, yeah, that's really great, but it can also look or can cause hopelessness.
Hmm.
Because we actually saw that in StarCraft 1 Pro League, where certain teams just could not win, and then it would cause
Hmm.
sponsors to eventually and gradually pull out. Um, it took a much longer time, but in Korea, there's a lot of teams that struggle to obtain proper sponsorship. And so
Yeah.
if SKT, KT keep winning, I mean, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but I think that some of the LCK teams are also partly funded by Chinese organizations.
Yeah.
And so that's weird as hell in itself. And I know that certain Korean teams in the past struggled to get anything, even
Hmm.
like drink sponsorships or something, like the Hot Six stuff or something. They can't even get that. Um, and it's becoming more and more difficult. And I wonder what that means for the game as it moves forward. Um,
I,
yeah.
I think, yeah, and part of the reason why I think China has been incredibly successful in, like, to an extent, attaining sponsorship and funding is that they have looked at alternatives besides simply being good to get these sponsorships.
Hmm.
And so my fear is less that the esport will die off and more that it becomes much more about commercialization and less about competition and like
Right.
this kind of thing of striving to be the best, which I don't know, some people like that. They like interacting with their favorite pros and like being amused by them, but that's not personally what appeals to me about the game.
Hmm.
So for me, this is something that I just like am kind of constantly afraid of. So I just like I really think that it's worth it to aspire to be the best team in the world, even
Hmm.
if you're not a Korean team. And I think it's you have to really start to examine what are ways that we can do it, and if it's something that is going to take you a long time, because if you're honest with yourself, it probably will, then you need to decide like, is this an investment that's worth it for me? If you
Right.
decide it's not, then I guess that's absolutely an option. Um, I guess to an extent, people bring up the franchising thing.
Hmm.
Maybe franchising would be a way to incentivize that kind of thing because you're no longer worried about keeping your spot in the LCS,
Right.
uh, which to an extent guarantees you some minimum level of sponsorship.
Hmm.
But so maybe that's something to look at. But
I'll be
and
honest that I
again,
haven't looked at that topic or subject nearly enough
mhm,
to comment on it. But
yeah,
yeah.
it's way too nuanced to
Hmm.
get into it, and I'm gonna like say that I'm not like fully on board with the entire thing.
Hmm.
So I just am suggesting it as a possible option.
Hmm.
Um, I mean, there are small ways that Riot can get involved. I'm going to say that I don't necessarily agree with mandating like a reserve league, which is something that they've tried in China at least.
What's a reserve league?
Because in China there is a reserve league that's like the LPPL, and I think
Huh?
some teams actually used it well.
Okay.
Uh, Weirdly, LGD kind of used it well because they ended up promoting a jungler from the reserve league. But what the reserve league is that Tencent came in and said, okay, we're going to have LSPL, we're going to have LPL, and we're going to have this reserve league.
Hmm.
For the reserve league, you need to be able to field 5 players on this team. And because LSPL and LPL have this very strict separation, you can't have the thing with like NA and EU where you're bringing your challenger players
Hmm.
into your team for a week or whatever.
Right.
Uh, if you're on an LSPL team, you're on the LSPL team. If you're on the LPL team, you're on the LPL team. But the LPPL, you could bring players from the LPPL squad onto the LPL like within a week's notice. So it was like this
Okay.
kind of encouraging having a sub sister team, right?
Uh huh.
In general. And a lot of LGD kind of initially started out like, oh, okay, I guess we just sign these like random challenger players. Like, what are we supposed to do with this? And then they got really lucky with a jungler
Hmm.
that they ended up promoting to their team. Some of the teams like it because they think of it as like if you're on our LSPL team, you never get to play LPL and you really want to play LPL.
Hmm.
So like maybe being on LPPL is better, but a lot of teams just kind of think of it as useless and haven't really invested into it. And it's really hard to commercialize it, I think, to an extent as well. So, I mean, I don't know if it's necessarily a good thing to mandate that kind of issue, uh, but it's something to consider also.
Hmm. Well, I think as a conclusion to this, one of the points that I didn't get to bring up was also what happens if you have a player that does want to be the best, but he's surrounded by four people that just want to win? Because that's
Right.
something I've witnessed,
Hmm.
personally. And that can be demoralizing, and that can really just suck out the passion from someone and all of their ambition. Um, and that's something that's cultural.
Yeah.
I feel like one of the main topics we didn't dive deep into because it's so complex, because there's all different types of cultures and what that really means, and then seeing how they interact together and get along, etc. But the cultural component, I feel, does cause an
Right.
innate disadvantage to some degree that you
Sure.
really need to find a way to work around. And I'm not even sure how you work around it, because if you throw coma into, what a lot of people like to think of Coma as some god tier coach. They don't even know what the fuck he does.
Hmm.
They don't sit in the SK Telecom house.
Yeah.
They have no idea what his actual coaching style approach is, and they comment like they know what it is. But if Coma hypothetically went to a Western team and he's like, okay, we're gonna do this, and the one of the players just looks at him and he's like, no, I'm
Yeah.
not, I'm just not. Like, I don't even know how the fuck he reacts or what he even does at that point. And I think it would be so interesting, like a goddamn reality TV show. Like fucking Coma goes to NA.
Yeah,
Oh
I
shit.
actually, I've talked about this, at least, I mean, with other people, not necessarily publicly, but I do think that you definitely see a gap in how effective top Korean teams or players versus how effective top Korean coaches are as imports, or because they come to an environment and they literally don't know how to deal with like this kind of pushback. And it's like there's one of my favorite stories that's like they actually did this really in-depth interview on this, was
Mhm.
when a really I'm just gonna flat out say he was incompetent. He was an incompetent Korean coach, but he came to
Hit me with
OMG,
it. Give
right?
me give me the name.
He's actually on Dignitas now.
Give me it.
Um,
Give me that name.
let me see if I can find it.
Yeah,
He's
you
on
find that for
Dignitas
me.
and he was on Spenu. I don't remember his name off the top of my
Wait,
head.
didn't the Dignitas Korean coach get fired? And then they brought in the
Uh,
solution?
they had they had two. One of them was this guy, and I recognized his name, and like I kept saying Dignitas was overrated because I knew this guy. It's just like yes, but then I think he probably was fired. Like I that would make sense. Organization. Coach. It says he's still on it, but I think it's this guy. 'Cause there were two of them.
This is the important part, Kelsey.
Sure. It's the super important part. It's like calling out these guys. Uh, let's see. Yeah, okay, it is. It's Park Jae-sok. I can't
Jisop?
pronounce.
Jisop?
Yeah.
What's his gamer ID?
He doesn't, it just says Park is his gamer ID.
Okay.
Mm,
See, I
yeah.
think that there's a false belief that Korean coaches actually coach the game 100%
Hmm.
of the time, because most of them don't.
Hmm.
They facilitate conversation, and they get the communication to flow properly, and they have enough of an understanding that they can let the players come to the conclusion themselves. But in the same sense, that ties back to the thing that I said before, that Korean challengers, Korean LCK pros, they can play other roles at a severely high level. This was the same way in StarCraft 1. In StarCraft 1, it was mandatory to actually play the other races. You could not just play your own race. Um, and so when you have five players that, they might not play all five lanes, but they play the lanes to a much higher level
Hmm.
than the average NA or EU pro, it's going to enable a healthier amount of conversation. Because some of the things I've had on my stream, I've had a few Korean challengers that, they speak English, they come on my stream, and they talk about how in NA, you can literally sit there and say, okay, this is, you go from point A to point B, and this is what's going to happen. And you'll have an NA pro sit there and be like, yeah, that's cool. I see what you're saying, but I disagree. And I'm like, no, there's no disagreeing here. Like this, this is actually black and white in this regard.
Hmm.
Um, and they say that it almost puzzles them in a way, and it puzzles me too, that you can actually sit there and have disagreements on things that should be able to be replicated, and it's the most bizarre shit in the entire world. And then it begs the question of, is it just pride? You know, do they actually recognize that they're wrong in that moment, but they don't want to say it? But then that causes a stunt in growth because it slows down the process.
And I do think that it can cause a stunt, and this goes back to the idea that I think that there are cultural differences that can be leveraged, but I think it also can, like this kind of almost combative environment can lead to more interesting discussions, or more like, to an extent, more sure or more confident solutions. Because if you're constantly like challenging, even if it's just like a pride thing, eventually, like if you are able to have a coach that can have the authority to come in and say, okay, this like makes more sense, or we're going with this after hearing this discussion or debate, I think can be a different way of coming to an answer that can be thorough in different ways. It really just depends on how you manipulate the situation or how you use the situation. Again, I think you brought up earlier just like the environment or the attitude of having a player who's really driven to be the best versus players who just want to win. And I do think that this is something that when you build a team, you can't just look at the individual skill. You can't just look at these types of things. You have to make sure you have a team that has similar goals in mind, or similar ideas or perspectives in mind. I actually have done interviews with players who have been on top teams, right? Who have said that like the reason I left this team wasn't because I felt like the players are bad, or because I didn't think we'd continue to succeed like at the top with this team. It was because we didn't have the same mindset or the same goals ultimately of wanting to go even further than that. And I think that so you have to be aware of what your team's goal is when you are building a team, like at the time you are building a team also.
Yep, I agree with that entirely. And I think that it's important to not let it get to a point where the person that does genuinely want to keep improving just succumbs to, okay, let me stream, or let me get those Twitter impressions, because that's when they've basically died. It goes back to the thing I said earlier, is that most Western pros would rather be ruined by praise than saved by criticism. Can't criticize them in any way. And the ones that do read criticism and they react to it in a positive manner, I think that it's very obvious who they are. And, you know, they really do take stuff from it and grow. But yeah, so I think that's pretty much it on this specific topic. Yeah. I don't have anything else to really touch on in the Korean import regard. Teams are still gonna import Koreans, and they're gonna, you know, keep going forward. But the real problem, it has nothing to do with the players, nothing to do with the ladder. Go be toxic all that you want, as long as you're not getting banned. You know, and the thing about needing to play multiple champions, no, you don't, because the fucking the meta changes every 2 weeks or 4 weeks or something. You don't need to play champions. All that you need to do is get recognized. You need to be so good that people can't ignore you. All right, toxicity is not going to make it so that you're not able to get in, because at the end of the day, once staffs get their head out of their ass and they realize that, hey, players don't actually make the calls here in terms of who is going to be on the team and who's not going to be on the team, because there is I've seen a million times players absolutely despise each other. They meet in real life and everything's peachy. That's just like how it goes, you know, meeting online and saying stuff that happens all the fucking time. And even in Korea that happens. So that's just common. So cut the bullshit. Like it's so ridiculous to say that these things are somehow criteria for measurements of getting noticed and picked up, because it's just not true. Just fucking get good.
Yeah.
That's it.
Get good. And,
get good.
I mean, like, I think, again, my message is, like, staff, because I feel like all I've done this entire thing is criticize staff, and it's just, like, if you are competent, prove it, I guess, and good luck, because like you have to remember that you're not just responsible for making yourself look good. You're not just responsible for keeping your job, but by accepting a staff position in an organization, you're accepting responsibility for at least 5 players, right?
Mm-hmm.
You're accepting responsibility in a great deal of responsibility for their success or their failure. Obviously, they still have to do their job, but like you do have to do yours as well.
Right.
So,
All right. I think that about wraps it up. So,
Mhm.
no, thanks for doing this, though. Really, because I feel like
Thanks for
this
having
was,
me on.
yeah, productive. It was a fun collaboration. So, all right. Well, I will talk to you later on. And thanks everyone that watched the video. And you can follow us on Twitter, and the links are below and whatnot. So, all right. Bye. Bye, Kelsey.
Bye.
See you.